There's a special kind of coldness reserved for the person who is supposed to be family. My name is Helen Ross, and I'm a ghost at my own family's table. I can plan a gala for a governor, but I just discovered I'm the only person in my entire family not invited to my sister's engagement party. I wasn't just forgotten, I was deliberately erased. For years, I've built a life of success to prove I was worthy, but in their eyes, I'm still invisible. They think I'll just fade away, but they have no idea who I've become. The question is, what happens when the ghost decides to haunt the party, like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel? We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. My phone buzzed on the polished glass of my desk, a sterile interruption to the seating chart I was finalizing for the governor's ball. It was the family group chat, a place where I was mostly a digital ghost. Mom. Claire has the most wonderful news. A second buzz. We're finally celebrating. The vagueness was a familiar ache, a specific kind of chill that settled right under my ribs. Another text, this time just to me. Helen, you must try to make time. It's so important. Try to make time. As if I, Helen Ross, the woman who coordinates timelines for 300-person galas and million-dollar fundraisers, couldn't manage my own calendar. The tension was already there, thick and suffocating. They weren't asking me, they were informing me with the built-in assumption that my world was somehow less important, more flexible, and ultimately optional. They assumed I wasn't worthy of a direct invitation, or perhaps that I just wouldn't show up. It was, after all, Claire's day. It had always been Claire's day. I stared at the message, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes, and I was suddenly 9 years old again. It was our shared birthday, my 10th, her 7th. I had asked for a microscope. Claire had demanded a pony. When I came downstairs, the living room was filled with pink balloons and a massive banner that read, "Happy Birthday, Claire." My microscope was in a small brown bag on the kitchen counter, next to a note that said Dad would be too busy with the pony rental to take me to the park. I'd spent the day watching my sister, our parents flanking her, their faces beaming with a pride I had never earned. I learned to fend for myself early. I organized my own high school graduation party because they were busy with Claire's regional soccer finals. I paid for my own college, scraping by with scholarships and brutal part-time jobs while they co-signed the lease on Claire's charming and expensive uptown apartment. Now I was one of the most sought-after event planners in the state. My life was a monument to control, precision, and success built from the materials of their neglect. My clients respected me, my team revered me, and my name opened doors. Everywhere, it seemed, except the one to my own childhood home. I couldn't stand the ambiguity. I hit dial. Mom answered on the second ring, her voice bright and brittle. Helen. Did you see the news? Isn't it wonderful? Hi, Mom. What news? The texts are pretty vague. Is Claire engaged? A short, tight laugh. Oh, Helen, always so literal. Yes, of course she's engaged, and we're having a party for her. This Saturday. This Saturday. 4 days away. My mind instantly scanned the logistics, the impossibility of it. Mom, why am I just hearing about this now? You know my schedule? Well, we just assumed you'd be swamped, she said, her voice dropping into that familiar dismissive tone. You know, with your events. We didn't want to bother you. It's really just a family thing. I am family. I said the words tasting like metal. I can manage my own schedule. I just need the details. Dad's voice cut in muffled as he took the phone. Helen, stop making this difficult. This is about Claire. It's her day. Your mother is handling everything. We just need you to be supportive, not complicated, belittled. Again. My contributions my whole life reduced to a complication. I was the messy variable in their perfect equation. I'm not trying to be complicated, Dad. I'm trying to be included. It's just Claire's day, Helen, he repeated, as if that explained everything. We'll see you if you can make it. The line clicked. I sat in the silence of my immaculate office, the silence of a life I had built to prove I was worthy, only to be reminded that the one place I couldn't prove it was home. I felt the familiar burn of tears, the old, cold sorrow, but I blinked it back. I had work to do. I'd try to push it aside, try to focus on table linens and floral arrangements, but the anger simmered a low, toxic heat. Later that night, unable to sleep, I mindlessly scrolled through social media. I usually avoided Claire's feed, a curated shrine to her perfect, effortless life. But I wasn't on her page. I was on my cousin's. And there it was, a shared post, not a text, not an evite, a full, professionally designed, embossed invitation, celebrating the future Mr. and Mrs. Michael Vance. The venue was the Silver Lake Country Club. The dress code was black tie optional. And then I saw it shared by my aunt with a gushing caption, the official digital guest list. I clicked the link. My breath caught. It wasn't a small family affair. It was everyone. Distant relatives I hadn't seen in a decade. Old neighbors, friends of my parents. Dozens and dozens of names. I scrolled, my heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I scrolled past names I didn't even recognize. I scrolled down to the R section. Ross Claire, Ross George, and Margaret. My finger hovered. I looked again, and again. My name wasn't there. I wasn't just an afterthought. I was an omission. I wasn't forgotten. I was excluded. Deliberately. Entirely. Sleep didn't come. How could it? I lay in the dark, the 4 a.m. silence of my apartment, a hollow echo of the void my family had carved out for me. The image of the guest list was burned onto the back of my eyelids, a digital monument to my own invisibility. The initial sting of sorrow, that familiar childish ache of being left out, began to recede. It was replaced by something colder, sharper. It was the clicking into place of 1,000 scattered puzzle pieces. This wasn't a mistake, it was a summary. My mind, usually a fortress of schedules and logistics, became a gallery of my past, showcasing every small, forgotten humiliation. I saw myself at 15 standing in the doorway while Dad taught Claire how to change a tire, his voice patient and proud. When I'd asked to learn, he'd waved me off. "Helen, this is grubby stuff. Go read one of your books." I saw Mom at my college graduation, the one I'd paid for, spending the entire celebratory lunch talking about Claire's upcoming sorority formal. When I'd tried to interject to share my honors thesis, she'd patted my hand. "That's nice, dear. Oh, Claire, did you decide on the blue dress or the green?" Every micro-betrayal was a pinprick, and tonight I was finally bleeding. Claire, always the center, always basking in a light I was apparently born to stand outside of. That time in high school, she'd forgotten to give me the invitation to a mutual friend's Sweet 16, when I found out my parents had dismissed it. "Oh, Helen, don't be so sensitive. Claire has so much on her mind." The humiliation of walking into a room and having the conversation instantly stop, of being dismissed, of my achievements being met with polite, vacant stares, while Claire's every minor whim was celebrated as a triumph. It wasn't just neglect, it was a strategy. They needed me to be small so Claire could feel big. They needed me to be the failure so she could be the success. But the script had flipped. I was the success. My name on a contract meant something. My word was bond. My entire professional life was built on merit, on delivering results, on being seen and valued for what I brought to the table. And my family? My family was obsessed with appearances. Their status-conscious world was a fragile house of cards built on the idea of success, not the substance of it. They wanted the perfect daughter, and when I didn't fit the mold, too ambitious, too independent, too much, they had simply edited me out of the picture. The hypocrisy was suffocating. They would stand at that party bathed in the glow of their perfect curated life, while the one person who had actually achieved the things they pretended to value was deliberately, surgically removed. The coldness in my chest finally solidified. The hurt was still there, but it wasn't a weakness anymore. It was fuel. It was resolve. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to call them screaming and demand an apology I'd never get. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of my pain. A plan began to form, not a messy emotional tantrum, but a quiet, precise strategic maneuver. My event planner mind took over, seeing the flaws in their logistics, the weaknesses in their narrative. I would attend. I wouldn't go to make a scene. I wouldn't go to humiliate them, not really. I would go to assert my agency. I would go to be seen. I would go to remind them, and perhaps myself, that I was not a ghost. I got out of bed, the darkness of the apartment feeling less like a prison and more like a staging ground. I walked to my desk, the city lights a distant glitter. I opened my laptop. My hands, which had been trembling an hour before, were steady. I wasn't scrolling through social media anymore. I was scrolling through my contacts. A list of people built not on blood, but on respect, on merit. I saw the name of a foundation CEO I'd worked with, a woman who had personally thanked me in a speech for saving her annual gala. I saw a journalist who owed me a favor after I gave her an exclusive. I saw my mentor, Ethan Parker, a man who commanded more respect in this city than my father ever would. These people didn't just see me, they validated me. My worth wasn't tied to the Ross family name. My name stood on its own. I began to type. My plan wasn't just to show up. It was to show up as Helen Ross, the woman I had built, not the daughter they had discarded. I drafted a simple, elegant message. I sent it to 3 of my most influential allies, people whose presence would speak louder than any argument I could ever make. My dear friend, it began. I find myself attending a small family gathering this Saturday evening at the Silver Lake Country Club. It's a celebration for my sister. It would mean the world to me if you would accompany me as my personal guest. I have a feeling it will be memorable. I hit send. I wasn't crashing a party. I was repositioning an asset. And that asset was me. The next 2 days were a masterclass in psychological warfare waged entirely on Claire's Instagram feed. It started with a picture of her at a fitting champagne flute in hand. Caption: "Can't wait to celebrate with everyone who truly loves and supports us. Family first. # blessed." The italics were a scalpel. Everyone. It was a direct, subtle mockery, a digital sneer aimed right at me, reinforcing the guest list I was never meant to see. She was so confident in my exclusion, so certain of my irrelevance, that she could afford to be magnanimous to her adoring public. Another post followed, a candid shot of her, and Mom, heads bent together, laughing over what looked like seating charts. Mom is a literal angel, handling every single detail to make sure it's perfect. The implication hung in the air, thick and toxic. I was an imperfect detail, a problem to be handled, or better yet, erased. The betrayal was no longer just an omission. It was an active, ongoing campaign. My anger was a cold, clean fire. I had to call. I had to know what they would say to my face. I dialed, and this time Mom picked up, her voice already strained. "Helen, I really don't have time. We're in the middle of a crisis with the florist. I won't take a minute, Mom. I just need to confirm. I will be attending on Saturday." Silence. A heavy, loaded pause that stretched for a full 10 seconds. I could hear Dad murmur in the background. "Who is it?" "It's Helen," Mom said, her voice flat. "She says she's coming." "Well, of course, dear," she finally said, the false brightness returning sharp as broken glass. "We just assumed—" "Well, never mind. It's all arranged, you see." "Arranged," the seating Helen. "It's all done. We really can't make any changes now. You understand? I'm sure you can just find a seat somewhere. Or maybe you could help Mrs. Gable with the guest book. You're so organized, after all. A minor role, a task, not a guest, not a daughter, an unpaid vendor." I was being dismissed, demoted in real time. "Don't worry about my seat, Mom," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I'll manage." "Good. Just—" "Helen, try not to make a fuss. This is Claire's night. Let her have it." The line went dead. The desire for recognition, that deep childish yearning to be seen by them, warred violently with an acute, paralyzing fear of humiliation. What if I walked in with my guests and they just ignored me? What if Claire in her element turned it into a joke, painting me as the bitter, jealous older sister? What if my allies saw me not as powerful but as pathetic, dragging them into a tacky family squabble? For a moment my resolve wavered. I was a professional. This was personal, messy, and unpredictable. It was everything I trained myself to avoid. I could just not go. I could just let the silence be my answer, let them have their perfect, curated party without the blemish of my presence. I could stay in my world, the one I built, the one where I was respected. But that would be letting them win. It would be accepting their narrative that I was invisible. I picked up the phone. This was not a call I could make to a friend. I needed a strategist. I needed Ethan Parker. He picked up on the first ring, his voice warm and immediate. "Helen, I was just thinking about you. Did you see the latest polling on the governor's race? Your ball moved the needle." "Ethan," I said, and my voice cracked just once. I hated it. I took a breath, composed myself, and laid out the entire story, from the vague texts to the guest list, to Claire's mocking posts, to the phone call with my mother. I told it not as a daughter, but as a client presenting a problem. "They've miscalculated their leverage," Ethan said, his voice devoid of pity, which is exactly what I needed. It was full of analysis. "They see you as the 15-year-old girl. You were not the woman who holds this city in the palm of her hand for 3 months of the year. They're relying on your old wounds, so you must rely on your new strength." "But to walk in there, Ethan, it feels like walking into an ambush." "It's only an ambush if you're unarmed," he said. "And you, Helen, are an arsenal. You're not going there for their approval. You're going for your own liberation. You're going to show them who you are, not ask them to finally see you. There's a difference." His words settled me. The fear didn't vanish, but the determination crystallized around it. He was right. This wasn't a request for acceptance. It was a statement of fact. My army was no longer a vague idea. It was a necessity. I spent the next hour solidifying my support. I didn't just need bodies. I needed weight. I called the editor-in-chief of the city's lifestyle magazine, a woman I'd secured an impossible venue for. I texted a prominent philanthropist whose charity auction I had chaired, doubling its profits. I confirmed with the foundation's CEO and the journalist. They weren't just allies. They were my community, my proof of worth, my shield. The anxiety was still there, a hummingbird in my chest, but the hope was stronger. This was no longer just about family. It was about my entire identity. The last text I sent was to Ethan. "I'm in. Are you?" His reply came back almost instantly. "My tux is pressed. What time are we making our entrance?" The confirmations began to roll in one by one. "Wouldn't miss it, Helen. I'm there. Absolutely. Looking forward to meeting this famous sister of yours." My family was busy with florists and seating charts, blissfully, arrogantly unaware. They were planning a party. I was planning a reckoning. My apartment, usually a sanctuary, became a war room. This was no longer just a family drama. It was an event, and I was the planner. My professional instincts, honed by years of managing chaos, took over. I knew the Silver Lake Country Club. I'd managed a benefit there 2 years prior. I knew the layout, the sightlines, the exact moment a person walking through the main ballroom doors would become the center of attention. My parents, amateurs in their own social climbing, would have placed the receiving line just inside the foyer, a bottleneck of fake smiles. They would be there for the first 45 minutes, greeting their approved guests. We would arrive at the 60-minute mark. Not late enough to be rude, but just late enough to ensure the room was full. The music was playing, and my parents would have already migrated to the main bar, their backs to the door. The visual impact would be total. I spent an hour on the phone, not just confirming my allies, but coordinating them. I booked a single black car service to retrieve Ethan, the CEO, and the philanthropist. They would be my entourage. They weren't just attending with me. They were arriving as my contingent. I instructed the driver on the precise drop-off timing. This was a production, and I would leave nothing to chance. Then I rehearsed. I stood in front of my floor-to-ceiling mirror, the city lights blurry behind me. I imagined Claire rushing over her smile, a brittle mask. "Helen, I had no idea you were coming." I practiced my response, my voice even warm, almost sympathetic. "Of course I'm here, Claire. I wouldn't miss your day." I imagined my mother, her face pale, her eyes darting to my guests. "Helen, what is this? Who are these people?" I'd just smile. "Mom, you know Ethan Parker. And this is Alara Vance from the Children's Foundation. They were so excited to celebrate with us." Us. The word was a weapon, a claim to a space they had denied me. I imagined my father's stony silence, the judgment radiating from him. I would meet his gaze not with defiance but with an unshakable calm. I would not let him make me 15 again. But as I ran the scenarios, the strategic coldness was breached. The complexity of it all, the sheer tangled mess of my own heart, threatened to overwhelm me. This was my family. The people I was planning to outmaneuver were the same people whose approval I had craved my entire life. I felt a deep, aching resentment that this was necessary, that I couldn't just show up in a simple dress hand, Claire a gift, and feel loved. That toxic, stubborn love, the kind a child never outgrows, was still there, buried under the layers of anger and resolve. I wanted recognition, yes, but what I truly, desperately wanted was to be seen. And if I couldn't be seen for who I was, I would make damn sure I was seen for what I had become. The night before the party, I laid out my armor. It wasn't a party dress. It was a statement. A tailored, deep emerald silk jumpsuit. Elegant, severe, and utterly professional. It was the color of money and control. I reread the final confirmation texts from my guests. "See you tomorrow. We're with you, Helen." I felt a wave of apprehension so strong it made me sit down. The fear was back, the fear of humiliation. This could backfire. They could paint me as the villain, the unhinged, jealous sister who hijacked the party. But then a new feeling pushed through it, something electric and sharp exhilaration. It was the same feeling I got in the 5 minutes before the doors opened on a $1,000 plate gala. It was the moment the plan was set, the pieces were in motion, and all I had to do was execute. I was betting on myself. I was done being a ghost. Tomorrow they would see me. We arrived. The car purred to a stop under the country club's opulent portico. Through the tinted glass, I could see the soft glow of the foyer, hear the distant thrum of music and conversation. Ethan, seated beside me, simply nodded. "Showtime, Helen." I took a breath. The apprehension was gone, replaced by a quiet, vibrating focus. My army stepped out of the car behind us, a formidable group of influence and power. I smoothed the silk of my jumpsuit. I was not the forgotten daughter. I was Helen Ross. And I was about to make my entrance. We didn't just walk in. We made an entrance. My timing was perfect. The foyer was empty. The greeting line dissolved. The main ballroom was alive, a sea of cocktail dresses and suits, bathed in the warm glow of chandeliers. And as I'd predicted, my parents and Claire were holding court near the grand fireplace, their backs to the door. We stepped onto the polished marble threshold, a group of 5, and the delicate bubble of noise burst. It happened first as a ripple, not a wave. A man nearby, a distant uncle, stopped mid-sentence. His eyes widened. A woman beside him turned her champagne flute, pausing halfway to her lips. The whispers started a sibilant hiss that spread through the room. "Is that? Who is she with? That's Ethan Parker." The collective gaze of the room shifted, pulling toward us like a magnet. My father was the first to sense the change. He turned, a politician's smile fixed on his face, ready to greet whatever new important guest had arrived. The smile didn't just fade, it cracked. I saw his blood pressure rise in his neck, a flush of angry crimson. He saw me. Then he saw Ethan Parker. Mom turned a second later, her hand fluttering to her pearls. Her face went pale, a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. And then Claire. Her laughter died in her throat, her head snapping toward the door. Her expression was a slow-motion car crash of disbelief, then confusion, then a dark, possessive fury. She had been the sun, and I was the eclipse. We moved forward. I did not rush. I walked at my own pace, a pace I set for governors and CEOs, and I let the room watch. I nodded to my shocked uncle. I smiled at a few of my parents' friends, who looked at me as if I had risen from the dead. Ethan was at my side, a bastion of quiet authority. My other guests fanned out slightly, an impenetrable wall of influence. We reached the fireplace. The small circle of my family was a frozen tableau of shock. "Helen," my father said, his voice a low growl. It was not a greeting. It was an accusation. "Dad, Mom, Claire," I said, my voice perfectly pitched, carrying just enough. "What a beautiful party." I turned to my mentor. "I don't believe you've all been properly introduced. This is my mentor, Ethan Parker." Ethan, ever the diplomat, extended a hand to my father. "George, Margaret, a pleasure. Helen speaks of you often." My father stared at his hand, forced to take it. The power dynamic in the room had tilted on its axis. "And this is Alara Vance from the Children's Foundation," I continued, gesturing to the CEO. "Alara, these are my parents." "A pleasure," Alara said, her smile sharp. "Helen is a miracle worker. She saved our auction. We simply adore her." "We adore her." The words hung in the air. I saw my mother flinch. This was my world, a world where I was valued, and I had brought it crashing into theirs. As I stood there commanding the attention of the most powerful people in the room, a memory sharp as a shard of glass cut through. I was 16 at this very club for a family New Year's Eve. I was trying to talk to my father about a debate club victory. He'd held up a hand. "Not now, Helen," and turned to Claire, who had just walked in. "Claire. There you are, sweetheart. You look beautiful. Now this is a dress." I had vanished. Now I was the only person they could see. Claire, desperate to reclaim her narrative, finally moved. She stepped forward, her laugh high and brittle. "Helen, my goodness, what a shock." She looped her arm through her fiancé's, pulling him close like a shield. "I can't believe you're here, and you brought clients." She gestured vaguely at my guests. "To my engagement party, I guess I shouldn't be surprised. You always did know how to make everything about work." The bitter, jealous sister card. It was her last move, an attempt to embarrass me, to shrink me back down to my designated role. The whispers in the room reignited. This was the moment. I could feel the expectation, the collective breath-holding. My parents were rigid, hoping Claire's clumsy strike would land, that I would break, cry, or scream. I did none of those things. I simply smiled. A small, calm, knowing smile. I looked past Claire, my gaze landing on my mother, then my father. "I'm not here as a client," I said, my voice quiet, but cutting through the silence. "I'm not here as your assistant mom, and I'm not here as the sister you thought you could erase Claire." I held their gaze one by one, a queen holding her court. "I'm here because I am a Ross, and I am done waiting for an invitation to my own life." The silence that followed my declaration was a physical weight. It was the sound of a universe realigning, of a narrative shattering. The music, which had been a low hum, seemed to stop entirely. My father's face, which had been a mask of rage, was now a complicated mess of calculation. He looked from me to Ethan, then to Alara, then back to me. He, a man who built his world on the perception of status, was suddenly realizing that the daughter he'd written off was not a liability, but a high-value asset. He was doing the math, and he was coming up short. My mother, on the other hand, just looked broken. Her eyes were wide, her hands still at her pearls, as if she could clutch them hard enough to restore the world she'd known. This was not in her script. I was not her quiet, complicated Helen. I was a stranger in her house, flanked by power she couldn't control. And Claire. The fury on her face had curdled into something raw and ugly, pure, undiluted insecurity. Her fiancé looked deeply uncomfortable, his eyes darting between us. Claire had spent her entire life as the undisputed sun, and I had just proven I was a solar system. Her attempt to paint me as a work-obsessed loner had backfired spectacularly. My work was standing right next to me, draped in couture and shaking my father's hand. In that moment, watching them reel, a profound shift happened inside me. The fear of humiliation, the desperate childish need for their approval that had thrummed beneath my skin for decades simply evaporated. I had spent my life waiting for them to see me. Now they were all staring, and I realized with a sudden shocking clarity that their validation was irrelevant. I had not come here for them. I had come here for me. My worth wasn't something they could bestow or withhold. I had built it. I had earned it. I had validated myself by simply walking through that door. My presence, my allies, my calm, that was the victory. The confrontation wasn't about changing their minds. It was about proving to myself that I was the only one whose mind mattered. My father, a man who detested losing control, was the first to break. He cleared his throat, the sound like gravel. "Well," he said, forcing a brittle smile that didn't reach his eyes. We didn't realize you were bringing guests, Helen. We would have set more places." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close. But it was a concession. It was a white flag waved in panic. It was the first time in my life he had acknowledged my power. "That's quite all right, Dad," I said, my voice smooth as silk. "We're perfectly fine." My mother, still pale, murmured, "Yes, what a surprise." This was their awkward reflection. Not a deep dive into their lifelong neglect, but a frantic surface-level recalculation of my worth. The spell broke. The rest of the room, seeing that the family had not imploded, but had in fact yielded, took their cue. This was the critical phase. My community, my chosen allies, stepped in, reinforcing my value beyond my family's judgment. Ethan, ever the master strategist, turned to my stunned uncle. "David, good to see you. You must be incredibly proud of Helen. She's single-handedly redefining the event landscape in this city." My uncle, who had barely spoken to me in years, gaped. "Oh, yes, of course, Ethan. We always knew she was a hard worker." Alara Vance, meanwhile, had linked her arm with my aunt's, the one who had posted the guest list. "Margaret, your daughter is a marvel," she declared loud enough for everyone to hear. "I don't know what we'd do without her." The attendees, who only minutes before had been whispering, now approached me with curiosity and, for the first time, genuine respect. They saw me validated by people they admired, and it was a more powerful endorsement than any family name. I watched my family absorb this. My father awkwardly trying to engage Ethan in a conversation about the stock market. My mother desperately trying to smile as Alara recounted one of my professional triumphs. And Claire, who had retreated to the far side of the room, a statue of glittering resentment, refusing to meet my eye. I had won. I had proven my point. But as the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade, the triumph felt complex, almost hollow. The anger that had fueled me was gone, and in its place was a quiet, cold exhaustion. I had shattered the dynamic, but what was left in its place? I saw my mother look at me across the room. Her expression lost, almost pleading. I saw my father looking older than I'd ever seen him. I saw Claire isolated. I had the power now, the power I had always wanted. And with it came the terrible, agonizing decision. What did I do with it? Did I maintain this distance, living my life free of their toxicity? Or did I use this newfound leverage to try and build something new? The choice for the first time was entirely mine. The party was over. The guests had trickled out, my allies giving me a subtle nod of support, a squeeze of the arm before melting back into the night. Their purpose was served. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving behind the quiet, sterile hum of the cleanup crew. The grand ballroom, which had been my stage, was now just a room. And in that room my family remained, a scattered, shattered constellation. I could have left. I could have taken my victory and walked out that door back to my clean, controlled, independent life, leaving them in the wreckage. The resentment that had been my fuel for so long was gone, and I found myself in a strange, empty quiet. But leaving felt like an old pattern. Leaving was their move. My new power demanded something different. It demanded I stay. I chose dialogue. I walked over to my mother, who was sitting alone in a plush armchair, her shoes kicked off, looking small and exhausted. "Mom," I said. My voice was even, no tremor, no accusation. She looked up, her eyes red. "Helen, your friends, they're very impressive." "They're my friends, Mom. My family. The one I built, because the one I was born into." I made it clear I wasn't welcome. The words were stark, but I said them without malice. It was a simple statement of fact. "That's not true," she whispered, a reflexive defense. You were always so capable, so independent. You never seemed to need us." A memory flashed so sharp it almost made me laugh. I was 12 and I'd won the statewide science fair. I'd run home, the blue ribbon clutched in my hand. Mom had glanced at it. "That's nice, dear," and immediately turned to the phone. "George, you won't believe it. Claire was just voted wittiest in her class yearbook. Isn't that wonderful?" "I was 12, Mom," I said, my voice soft. "I won the state science fair, and you didn't even put the ribbon on the fridge. You were too busy framing Claire's wittiest certificate. I did need you. I just got tired of asking." Her face crumpled. It was the first time I had ever seen her look at her own actions. "Oh, Helen," she whispered, a hand going to her mouth. I didn't realize." It wasn't a complete absolution, but it was a crack. It was the first time she had acknowledged the truth. My father found me next by the fireplace. He still had his jacket on, his posture rigid. "You made your point, Helen," he said, his voice low. "You brought this circus. You embarrassed your sister." "No, Dad," I said, turning to face him, my new confidence a shield. "I made my point. You were embarrassed. Those are two very different things. Your embarrassment wasn't about Claire. It was about the fact that Ethan Parker, a man you've been trying to get a meeting with for 6 months, respects me more than you do." His jaw tightened. The direct hit. I remembered him teaching Claire how to read the stock market reports. "Our little shark," he'd called her. When I'd asked, he'd told me to focus on safe things like books. "You only respect what you can control, Dad, or what you think will elevate you. Tonight you saw my value and you realized you have no control over it at all." He was silent for a long time, staring into the dying embers of the fire. He didn't apologize. I didn't expect him to, but he finally turned his gaze heavy and truly looked at me. "You are more formidable than I gave you credit for." It was the closest he'd ever get to, "I'm sorry." And it was for now enough. I found Claire last. She was by the wedding cake, picking at the icing. Her face was streaked with mascara. "Are you happy now?" she spat, her voice thick. "You got what you wanted. You ruined my entire night." I looked at her, and the decades of resentment, of petty jealousies just dissolved. I saw a girl who had been given everything except the one thing. I had a sense of self built on something real. "Was it your night, Claire?" I asked, my voice genuinely curious. "Or was it just a night where you were happy I wasn't allowed to be?" Her head snapped up. The question broke through her defense. "It was always so easy for you," she whispered, the tears coming back. "No," I said. "It looked easy to you. You were just there. They loved you. It was automatic. I had to earn it. I had to be perfect and pretty and fun. And you just were. You won things. You built this life. I hated it. I hated that you were so much, and I hated that they didn't see it, so I let them. It was easier. It was easier for me if you just weren't there." The confession hung in the air, raw and ugly. "So you let them make me invisible?" I said, not as a question, but as a final shared fact. "So you could be the only one they saw?" She nodded, sobbing. I took a breath. "And I resented you for being the one thing I couldn't be, the one they chose." I stepped closer. "That ends tonight, Claire. All of it." My parents had drifted over, drawn by the raw emotion. The three of them stood there, a broken unit, watching me. "I am not your shadow," I said to Claire. Then I looked at my parents. "And I am not your afterthought. I will be in this family, as I am. No more omissions, no more games. You will see me." My father, my mother, and my sister. They were silent, their faces a complex tapestry of guilt, shock, and a dawning, painful respect. And for the first time in my life, standing in the ruins of their perfect party, I wasn't the invisible daughter. I wasn't the ghost. I was Helen. And I was finally seen. The engagement party wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the quiet, difficult work. In the weeks that followed, I came to understand a profound truth. Self-worth isn't a trophy you win from your family. It isn't something they can grant you, and it isn't something they can take away. It's a structure you build yourself, brick by painstaking brick. My actions, the career I'd forged, the plan I'd executed, were the foundation. My integrity. The choice to show up as myself, to speak the truth, to stay for the hard conversation, instead of just dropping the bomb and leaving, was the framework. And my connections, my chosen community, were the walls and roof, the things that made it a home. The true celebration of my victory wasn't that night surrounded by the ruins of my family's expectations. It came 2 nights later. I'd invited Ethan, Alara, and my other allies to my apartment. It wasn't a party, it was a gathering. We drank expensive whiskey, the kind I'd bought for myself, and we didn't talk about my family. We talked about the governor's race, about Alara's upcoming foundation benefit, about the future. They didn't treat me like a wounded bird. They treated me like an equal, a peer. As Ethan raised his glass, he smiled. "To Helen," he said, his voice warm, "who understands that the best way to change the narrative is to write it yourself." We clinked glasses, the sound a clear, clean chime in the quiet of my home. That was my empowerment. It was freedom. It was the realization that I had a place to belong that wasn't contingent on me shrinking myself. The engagement concluded and the wedding planning began, but the dynamics were irrevocably altered. The shift wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a subtle, awkward, tectonic realignment. The first time my mother called me, I tensed, expecting a new subtle demand. Instead, she asked, "Helen, Claire is looking at the Grayson Hotel. You did that big charity event there. What did you think of their catering?" It wasn't, "I'm sorry." It was, "I respect your expertise." It was a start. A week later, I received a text from Claire. "Thank you for the flowers." I had sent a simple arrangement to her new apartment. No note, no subtext, just a gesture. Her reply was equally simple. It wasn't the barbed, competitive back and forth of our entire lives, it was just neutral. It was the sound of a ceasefire. My father, in his own way, changed the most. He didn't call, he didn't text. But at the next brief family dinner, one I had been explicitly invited to via a personal call from both parents, he did something he'd never done. He asked me, "How is work?" And when I told him, he listened. He listened as I detailed a complex negotiation, and at the end, he just nodded, a single sharp dip of his chin. "Good," he said. "That's good." It was a universe of recognition packed into a single word. I am still cautious. I am optimistic, but I am not naive. The habits of a lifetime aren't erased in one night. The scars are still there, but I am no longer defined by them. I am no longer the 15-year-old girl waiting for her father's approval. I am no longer the invisible daughter. I am empowered not because they finally see me, but because I finally see myself, and I refuse to look away. Tonight I'm standing not in their venue but in mine. I'm in my office high above the city, the lights a glittering carpet of a world I have in many ways conquered. I'm looking out at the skyline, a map of my own resilience. The balance of power has shifted, yes. But the real achievement isn't just the recognition I've gained from them, it's the recognition I've given myself. I am the architect of my own life. I am a product of my own agency, my own independence, and the community I built. I am Helen Ross. And for the first time in the quiet of my own earned success, I finally understand what that means. And with that, Helen finally closed a painful chapter at last, able to breathe her own air. Her journey shows what happens when self-worth is no longer up for debate. What part of Helen's plan resonated with you the most? We read every single comment of your thoughts, so please let us know below. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.